The sun hadn't yet broken over the volcanic ridges of Iwo Jima when Captain Howard Jarrell felt the first drops of hydraulic fluid hit his boot. It was March 1945. The Pacific War was grinding toward its bloody conclusion, and every B-29 superfortress that lifted off from the Marianas carried with it the weight of a nation's desperation. Each mission was a calculated gamble. 1,500 miles to Japan, 1,500 miles back, over an ocean that swallowed men and machines without mercy. Jarrell's B-29, tail number 42 to 24,628, had no name painted on her nose. She was just another silver giant in the 499th Bombardment Group, one of dozens that would take off that morning from Saipan's North Field. The mission was Tokyo. The target was the Nakajima Aircraft Engine Plant in Musashino. The stakes were everything. Inside the bomber, 10 men moved through their pre-flight rituals with practiced precision. Flight Engineer Staff Sergeant Raymond Mollo ran his hands over the control panel for the 4 Wright R-3350 Cyclone engines, each one capable of producing 2,200 horsepower. These weren't just engines, they were temperamental beasts, prone to overheating, catching fire, and failing at the worst possible moments. The R-3350 had killed more B-29 crews in training than enemy fighters had in combat. "Oil pressure's good on all 4, Mollo called out, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. He'd flown 12 missions. Each one had aged him a year. In the bombardier's compartment up front, Lieutenant Thomas Hanna checked his Norden bomb sight for the 3rd time. The device was worth its weight in platinum, a mechanical computer that could supposedly drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 30,000 feet. In reality, it was accurate enough to destroy a factory, and that would have to be enough. Behind them, in the radio operator station, Sergeant William Connors tuned his and /ART-13 transmitter to the group frequency. The radio was their only link to civilization once they crossed into enemy airspace. Without it, they were just another speck of aluminum over an endless blue void. The waist gunners, Sergeants Joseph DeLuca and Robert Steinberg, loaded belts of .50 caliber ammunition into their guns. Each belt held rounds that could punch through steel at 1,000 yards. They would need every one if the Japanese fighters found them. Tail gunner Sergeant Frank Morrison settled into his cramped compartment, a plexiglass bubble hanging off the back of the aircraft. It was the loneliest position on the bomber, 30 feet from the nearest crewman, with nothing but thin aluminum between him and the frozen hell of high altitude. If they went down, Morrison would likely drown before he could crawl forward. Captain Jarrell scanned the horizon. The sun was rising now, painting the Pacific in shades of orange and gold that seemed obscene given what they were about to do. Around him, 53 other B-29s were preparing for takeoff, their propellers beginning to spin, for blades per engine turning the morning air into a hurricane of noise and exhaust. "Tower, this is Lucky Striker Heavy, requesting clearance for takeoff." The voice crackled back through Jarrell's headset. "Lucky Striker Heavy, you are cleared for takeoff. Winds are east-northeast at 12 knots. Good hunting. Good hunting." As if they were going after deer instead of flying into the most heavily defended airspace on Earth. Jarrell pushed the 4 throttle levers forward. The Wright R-3350s roared to life, each engine gulping 200 gallons of fuel per hour, each propeller pulling 16,000 pounds of aircraft down the coral runway. The B-29 accelerated slowly, too slowly, some pilots thought, the runway falling away behind them at what felt like walking speed. At 140 miles per hour, Jarrell pulled back on the yoke. The nose lifted. The main gear left the ground. They were airborne. Mollo watched the engine instruments like a man watching a dying patient. Cylinder head temperature on number 3 was already climbing. Not unusual, but not good either. He made a note in his log. The formation took shape over the ocean. 54 bombers arranged in a combat box, layers of overlapping firepower designed to shred any Japanese fighter stupid enough to attack head-on. They climbed to 25,000 feet, where the air was so thin it felt like breathing through wet cotton, where exposed skin would freeze in seconds, where the temperature was 40 below zero. Japan was 6 hours away. The men settled into their positions, each alone with his thoughts. Hannah cleaned his bomb sight glass. Connors monitored the radio frequencies, listening for the coded warnings that meant enemy fighters were scrambling. Morrison scanned the empty sky behind them, knowing it wouldn't stay empty for long. Jarrell checked his watch. 0847 hours. They were on schedule, on course, and everything was going according to plan. That's when number 3 engine began to shake. It started as a vibration, barely noticeable, the kind of thing you might ignore on the ground. But at 25,000 feet over the Pacific Ocean, nothing is ignorable. Molo's eyes locked onto the instrument panel. Oil pressure on number 3 was dropping. "Skipper, we've got a problem with 3. Molo's voice was calm, professional, but Jarrell heard the edge in it. "How bad?" "Oil pressures down to 35 pounds and falling. Temperatures climbing." Jarrell's hands tightened on the yoke. They were 300 miles from Saipan, still 1,200 miles from Tokyo. Turning back now meant mission failure, meant someone else would have to fly through this hell another day, meant the war would last a little longer. "Can you stabilize it?" Molo worked the engine controls, adjusting fuel mixture, adjusting prop pitch, trying everything he'd been trained to do. The oil pressure continued to fall. 40 below zero outside, and the engine was cooking itself from the inside. "Negative, sir. If we don't shut it down, it's gonna catch fire." Jarrell made the decision every bomber captain dreaded. Shut it down. Feather the prop. Molo hit the feathering button. Number 3's propeller blades rotated until they were edge-on to the wind, reducing drag. The engine wound down to silence. The B-29 yawed slightly to the right as the asymmetric thrust tried to pull them off course. 3 engines. They could still make it to Tokyo on 3 engines. The B-29 was designed for this. That's what Jarrell told himself as they continued north, as Japan grew closer with every minute, as the ocean below them remained vast and empty and utterly indifferent to their survival. The Pacific stretched below them like hammered steel, endless and unforgiving. Captain Jarrell trimmed the aircraft to compensate for the dead engine, his right leg pressing hard on the rudder pedal to counter the asymmetric thrust. The B-29 wanted to turn right, always right, and fighting it required constant pressure, constant attention. His leg was already beginning to cramp. "Molo, give me a fuel calculation," Jarrell said, his voice steady despite the ice forming in his gut. "Can we make Tokyo and back on 3 engines?" The flight engineer hunched over his charts, running numbers that would determine whether they lived or died. Fuel consumption increased dramatically when flying on 3 engines. The remaining right R-3350s had to work harder, burn hotter, gulp more fuel to maintain altitude and airspeed. "It's gonna be tight, sir. Real tight. We'll make the target, but the return." Molo paused, rechecking his math. "We're looking at maybe reaching Iwo if we catch favorable winds." "Maybe. Iwo Jima." The volcanic rock that Marines had taken in February at a cost of 7,000 American lives. It was now the emergency landing strip for crippled B-29s, a last-chance haven for bombers that couldn't make it back to the Marianas. The island was 700 miles from Tokyo, 700 miles from Saipan. It was the middle of nowhere, and it was their only hope. "We continue," Jarrell said. There was no discussion, no vote. They'd come too far to turn back now. The formation droned northward. Inside the aircraft, the temperature was cold enough to frost the metal surfaces, cold enough that the men's breath came out in clouds despite their heated flight suits. In the waist section, DeLuca and Steinberg stamped their feet and blew on their hands, trying to keep blood flowing through fingers that might need to fire guns in the next few hours. At 1,142 hours, the radio crackled to life. "All aircraft, this is Lonesome Lady. Enemy fighters scrambling from Honshu." Estimate contact in 15 minutes. 18 to 20 bandits, possibly more. Connors acknowledged the transmission and passed the word through the intercom. Every man on the bomber tensed. They'd been expecting this. The Japanese didn't let formations of American bombers penetrate their airspace without a fight, but expecting it and experiencing it were different things. Morrison, in the tail gun position, was the first to spot them. Fighters. 5 o'clock level. 6, no, 8, 12 of them. They came out of the sun, where they always came from, a dozen silver specks that resolved into Nakajima Ki 84 He-8 fighters, each one armed with two 20mm cannons and two 12.7mm machine guns. The Japanese pilots were skilled, aggressive, and utterly committed to stopping the bombers. The formation tightened up. 54 B-29s, each bristling with .50 caliber guns, became a flying fortress of overlapping fields of fire. The Japanese fighters would have to thread a needle of lead and explosive shells to reach them. The first He-8 dove through the formation, its cannons flashing. Tracers arced through the air like deadly fireworks. A B-29 two planes to their left shuddered as shells struck its wing. Smoke began streaming from one of its engines. Target right, 2 o'clock high. Hannah called out from the bombardier's position. The nose gun and the top turret swung toward the attacking fighter. Both guns opened fire simultaneously, the sound like tearing canvas amplified 1,000 times. Brass casings tumbled through the interior of the aircraft, hot and smoking. The He-8 rolled away, untouched, diving below the formation to set up another pass. Another one. 9 o'clock level. This fighter came in from the left, cannon shells walking up the fuselage. GE of the B-29 flying on their wing. The bomber staggered, flames erupting from its number 2 engine. Jarrell watched as the pilot feathered the prop, watched the fire slowly die, watched the aircraft begin to fall behind the formation. "Stay tight," Jarrell commanded his crew. Falling behind meant death. Stragglers were easy prey. For 20 minutes, the air battle raged. The Japanese fighters attacked in pairs, diving through the formation, firing, breaking away, climbing to attack again. The B-29s flew in their rigid formation, guns hammering at anything that moved, the sky filling with smoke and tracers and the occasional splash of debris that had been an aircraft seconds before. A He-8 made the mistake of holding its attack run too long. 3 B-29s concentrated their fire on it. The fighter disintegrated in midair, pieces of wing and fuselage spinning away into the void. Then, as suddenly as they'd appeared, the Japanese fighters broke off. They'd expended their ammunition, or their fuel was running low, or they'd decided the cost was too high. The formation flew on, several bombers trailing smoke, but all still airborne, all still headed for Tokyo. Jarrell allowed himself a breath. They'd survived the fighter attack. Now came the flak. At 1,307 hours, the bombardier's voice came through the intercom, IP in 5 minutes. Coming up on the initial point. The initial point was where the bomb run began, where the bombers would fly straight and level for 6 minutes while the bombardiers lined up their sights. 6 minutes of absolute predictability, 6 minutes during which the Japanese anti-aircraft guns would have all the time in the world to find their range. Pilot to crew, we're starting our run. Hold steady. The Nakajima plant appeared through the haze, a sprawl of factory buildings, warehouses, and assembly halls. It was one of Japan's most important aircraft engine plants, producing the power plants for fighters and bombers. Destroying it would slow Japan's war effort, save American lives, bring the end closer. The flak started at 1,312 hours. Black puffs of smoke erupted around the formation, each one marking a 88mm or 120mm shell that had detonated, each one sending shrapnel in all directions at thousands of feet per second. The noise was deafening. Thunder that never stopped, explosions that walked through the sky like a giant's footsteps. Hannah stared through his bomb sight, making tiny adjustments, his hands steady despite the aircraft shaking from near misses. Left, left, steady, steady. A shell burst directly beneath them. The B-29 lurched upward as if punched by a giant fist. Shrapnel tore through the bomb bay doors, through the thin aluminum skin, through everything that wasn't armored steel. "We're hit." Steinberg's voice, high and tight. "Hydraulic lines are cut. I'm seeing fluid everywhere. Can you patch it?" Jarrell asked, his own voice remarkably calm. "I can try." The flak continued. Another B-29 took a direct hit, its wing folding upward like paper before the entire aircraft fell away, tumbling, trailing fire and debris and men who would never see home again. "Bombs away." Hannah's voice cut through the chaos. The B-29 lurched upward as 10,000 pounds of high explosive dropped away. Around them, the other bombers in the formation released their loads. 500 tons of bombs fell toward the Nakajima plant, a steel rain that would turn the factory into rubble. "Let's get the hell out of here." Jarrell banked the aircraft away from the target area, following the rest of the formation as they turned south, back toward the ocean, back toward safety. That's when number 1 engine exploded. It didn't seize or sputter or give warning. One moment it was running normally, the next moment there was a sound like a cannon shot and the engine tore itself apart. Pieces of cylinder head and piston flew through the cowling. Fire erupted from the nacelle. "Number 1's on fire." Mollo was already moving, hitting the fire extinguisher button, cutting fuel to the engine, feathering the prop. The fire didn't go out. Flames streamed back from the engine nacelle, orange and white, eating at the wing structure. If the fire reached the fuel tanks in the wing, they would have perhaps 5 seconds before the entire aircraft exploded. "Mollo status." Jarrell's voice was sharp now, the professional calm cracking. "Fire's not responding to extinguisher. It's in the nacelle structure. 2 engines gone. 800 miles of ocean between them and safety. And their wing was on fire." The fire burned like a torch mounted to their wing, a beacon visible for miles, announcing to every Japanese fighter and ship in the area that here was a crippled B-29, easy prey, struggling for survival. "Rate of descent." Jarrell snapped. 300 feet per minute and increasing. Mollo's voice was tight. "We're at 22,000 feet. At this rate we'll be in the water in 70 minutes. But they wouldn't have 70 minutes. They'd have maybe 20 before the fire burned through the wing spar and structural failure turned the B-29 into a coffin. Jarrell made another decision, this one based purely on physics and desperation. "Dive the aircraft. Maximum rate." "Sir." Mollo's voice carried disbelief. "You heard me. Full dive. We're going to blow out that fire." It was insane. It was brilliant. It was their only chance. Jarrell pushed the yoke forward. The B-29's nose dropped sharply, and the aircraft accelerated downward like a stone. The altimeter unwound rapidly. 20,000 feet. 18,000. 15,000. The airspeed indicator climbed past 300 miles per hour, past 350, approaching the B-29's structural limits. The wind screamed over the wings at nearly 400 miles per hour, a hurricane of air that tore at every surface, every rivet, every piece of the burning engine nacelle. The flames flickered, bent backward by the incredible wind pressure, and then, suddenly, went out. "Fire's out." Mollo's voice was almost joyful. "Fire's out. But we've got major structural damage to the nacelle and cowling." Jarrell pulled back on the yoke, gently, carefully, not wanting to overstress the damaged wing. The B-29 began to level off at 8,000 feet, much lower than he wanted to be, but they were still flying. Still alive. "Okay," Jarrell said, forcing his voice to remain steady. "Mollo, give me the assessment. What can these 2 engines give us?" The flight engineer looked at his instruments with the expression of a doctor examining a terminal patient. Number 2 and Number 4 are running hot. We're asking them to carry the entire aircraft. Oil pressure is holding, but temperature is high. If we push them too hard, we'll cook them. If we don't push them hard enough, we'll descend into the ocean. English, Malo. Can we make Iwo? There was a pause that felt like an eternity. I don't know, sir. It's 700 miles. At our current power settings, we're burning fuel at... Jesus, we're burning fuel at almost double normal rate. The math says we'll run dry about 50 miles short of Iwo. 50 miles. They would fall into the ocean within sight of salvation, so close they'd be able to see the volcanic peak of Mount Suribachi before the water closed over them. Options? Jarrell asked. We can dump weight, Malo said. Guns, ammunition, everything not bolted down. That'll reduce drag, improve fuel efficiency. Do it. Everyone, strip the aircraft. Guns, ammo, everything. If it's not keeping us in the air, it goes over the side. The crew went to work with frantic efficiency. DeLuca and Steinberg wrestled the .50 caliber waist guns from their mounts and pushed them out the open gunner's windows. 200 pounds each, gone. Morrison did the same with the tail guns. The ammunition cans followed, hundreds of rounds that would never be fired, plummeting toward the ocean below. Hanna removed his Norden bomb sight, that precious device worth thousands of dollars, and dumped it out the bombardier's window. Without bombs to drop, it was just expensive weight. Everything went. Tool kits. Survival gear beyond the absolute minimum. Even the armor plating behind the pilot's seats, steel that was supposed to stop bullets, now just dragged them toward the ocean. The B-29 flew lighter, marginally faster, infinitesimally more efficient. It wasn't enough. 2 hours into the flight, they were still 500 miles from Iwo Jima, still descending slowly despite Malo's best efforts to squeeze every bit of efficiency from the 2 remaining engines. We're at 6,000 feet, Malo reported. Best case scenario, we'll be at 2,000 feet when we reach Iwo. If the winds don't shift, if the engines don't quit, if nothing else goes wrong. Captain Jarrell looked at his fuel gauge. The needles were touching empty. The engines were running on vapor and hope. That's when Number 4 began to surge. The engine would roar normally for a few seconds, then its power would drop suddenly, then return, then drop again. It was starving for fuel, sucking air from the bottom of near-empty tanks. "Four's dying." Malo's voice cracked. "Fuel starvation. We've got maybe 5 minutes before it quits completely." 3 engines gone. Only Number 2 still running smoothly. Only one Wright R-3350 keeping them in the air. One engine that was never designed to carry a B-29's weight by itself. "Connors, get on the emergency frequency." Jarrell ordered. "Tell Iwo we're coming in on one engine. We'll be ditching in the water short of the island if we can't make it." "Roger." Connors's transmission went out. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Lucky Striker Heavy, one engine operational, 470 miles southeast of Iwo Jima, descending through 5,000 feet, 10 souls on board." The minutes crawled by. Number 4's surging became worse. 5 seconds of power, 10 seconds of nothing, a brutal rhythm that made the B-29 yaw and shake like a dying animal. And then it quit completely. Number 4's propeller windmilled freely for a moment before Malo feathered it. Now only Number 2 remained, one engine howling at maximum power, its cylinder head temperature redlined, its oil pressure dropping slowly but inevitably. They were at 3,500 feet. Iwo Jima was 200 miles away. The math said they had maybe 90 minutes of fuel remaining. The math also said they needed 120 minutes to reach the island. "We're not going to make it," Malo said quietly. It wasn't defeat in his voice, just mathematics. Just reality. Jarrell looked out his window at the ocean below. The water was rough, white caps marking where the wind stirred the surface. Ditching a B-29 in rough seas was a death sentence. The aircraft would break apart on impact, the ocean would flood through 100 torn seams, and the men inside would drown before they could escape. But they were still flying. Still alive. And as long as the engine turned, there was still a chance. "Pilot to crew," Jarrell said. "Prepare for ditching. Life rafts ready, positions secured. We're going to fly this bird until she won't fly anymore, and then we're going into the water as close to Iwo as we can get." The crew acknowledged, each man checking his Mae West life preserver, each man contemplating the cold reality that they were probably about to die. Morrison, in the tail, spoke up. "Skipper, I can see smoke on the horizon." Straight ahead. Smoke meant ships. Ships meant rescue. Ships meant maybe, just maybe, they'd survive this. How far? 20 miles, maybe less. 20 miles. At 180 miles per hour. Less than 7 minutes. Number 2's temperature gauge was pegged at maximum. The engine was literally destroying itself to keep them airborne. Mollo watched the oil pressure drop. 50 pounds, 45, 40. "Engine's not going to last much longer," Mollo said. "Oil pressure's critical. When it goes below 35 pounds, we're done." The smoke resolved into ships, a Navy destroyer escort and 2 patrol craft, part of the picket line that screened Iwo Jima from Japanese submarine and air attack. "Connors, radio those ships. Tell them we're ditching. Give them our position." "Already on it, sir." The ships responded immediately, altering course to intercept their flight path. But the ships were slow, doing maybe 20 knots, and the B-29 was burning its last reserves of life. Oil pressure, 38 pounds. 10 miles to the ships. Oil pressure, 35 pounds. The engine began to knock, a sound like someone hammering on the inside of the cylinders. 5 miles. Oil pressure, 33 pounds. "She's seizing," Mollo shouted. 30 seconds, maybe less. 2 miles. They could see individual sailors on the ship's decks now, see them scrambling to launch rescue boats, see them preparing for what was coming. 1 mile. Oil pressure, 28 pounds. The engine's hammering became a shriek, metal grinding on metal, bearing surfaces welding themselves together from heat and friction. "Everyone brace." Jarrell pulled the mixture controls to idle cutoff, killing the engine before it could catch fire, and pushed the nose down toward the ocean. The B-29 was a glider now, just a 74-foot wing with a 60-ton weight attached to it, descending at 2,000 feet per minute toward water that looked like concrete from this height. 500 feet. Jarrell extended full flaps, trying to bleed off airspeed, trying to make the impact survivable. 300 feet. The ships were directly below them now, their wakes white arrows pointing at salvation. 100 feet. Jarrell pulled back on the yoke, flaring the aircraft, bleeding off the last of their speed. 50 feet. The B-29 hit the water. The impact was like hitting a wall at 100 miles per hour. The B-29's belly struck the ocean surface and the aluminum skin crumpled instantly, crushing upward into the fuselage. Water exploded through the seams, through the wheel wells, through every opening in a spray that felt like being hit by 1,000 fists simultaneously. The aircraft skipped like a stone, rose 20 feet into the air, came down again even harder. This time the nose plowed under, and the ocean tried to claim them immediately. Water flooded through the bombardier's compartment, through the navigator's station, rising with terrifying speed. Captain Jarrell's head slammed into the control yoke despite his shoulder harness. Blood filled his mouth. Beside him, the co-pilot was unconscious, slumped in his seat, a gash across his forehead pumping crimson. "Out. Everyone out." Jarrell's voice was hoarse, barely audible over the sound of tearing metal and rushing water. In the waist section, DeLuca clawed at the emergency exit hatch, his hands slipping on the wet metal. The water was already waist-deep and rising. Steinberg helped him, both men putting their combined weight into the hatch until it finally popped free. Pacific water poured in through the opening, but it also meant escape. "Go, go, go!" DeLuca pushed Steinberg through the hatch first, then followed, kicking free of the sinking aircraft. The ocean was shockingly cold, even in the Pacific Spring, cold enough to steal breath and thought. Morrison escaped through the tail section, watching with horror as the rear of the aircraft began to fold downward, the tail breaking off from the fuselage. He swam hard, away from the wreckage, away from the suction that would pull him under when the bomber finally went down. In the cockpit, Jarrell unbuckled his harness and grabbed his co-pilot, shaking him hard. "Wake up! Wake up!" The man's eyes fluttered open, confused, blood running down his face. "We're in the water! Move!" They stumbled through the flooding cockpit toward the forward hatch. The water was chest-deep now, freezing, full of debris and fuel that made every breath taste of oil and death. Jarrell pushed his co-pilot through the hatch, then followed, surfacing into daylight and chaos. The B-29 was sinking fast, her nose already underwater, her tail rising at an impossible angle. The silver fuselage that had carried them across thousands of miles of ocean was dying, surrendering to the sea that had tried to claim them since they first took off from Saipan. "Swim away!" Mollo's voice, somewhere to Jarrell's right. "Get clear before she goes under." They swam, all of them, away from the sinking bomber. The life rafts hadn't deployed, they'd been damaged in the crash or were trapped inside the flooded compartments, so the men clung to pieces of debris, to seat cushions, to anything that floated. 300 yards away, the Navy destroyer escort was coming at flank speed, throwing up a massive bow wave. On the deck, sailors were already preparing rescue lines and nets. The B-29 gave one final shudder, her tail rising 15 feet into the air, and then she slipped beneath the surface. For a moment, they could still see her shape underwater, a silver ghost descending into darkness, and then she was gone. Air bubbles marked where she'd been for a few seconds more, then even those disappeared. Jarrell counted heads. "Sound off. Everyone report. Mollo here. Hannah, I'm good. Connors. DeLuca. Steinberg. Morrison." 7 voices. They'd started with 10. The co-pilot was unconscious but breathing, supported by 2 crew members. That was 8. "Where's Thompson?" Jarrell's voice was sharp. "Navigator. Where's Lieutenant Thompson?" Silence. The men looked at each other, looked at the empty ocean, and understood. Thompson had been at his station during the impact. The navigator's compartment was in the nose, the section that had taken the worst of the crash. He'd never made it out. And Riley, the radar operator. No answer. 2 men gone. The ocean had taken its price. The destroyer's motor launch reached them 5 minutes later. Sailors hauled the survivors aboard, wrapping them in blankets, checking for injuries. Jarrell was the last to leave the water, making absolutely certain no one else was out there, no other heads bobbing in the waves. The motor launch brought them to the destroyer, where the ship's doctor was waiting with his corpsman. They treated the co-pilot's head wound, put stitches in Jarrell's split lip, wrapped Steinberg's fractured wrist, gave everyone hot coffee laced with medicinal brandy. Captain Jarrell stood on the destroyer's deck, wrapped in a Navy blanket, watching the ocean where his aircraft had gone down. The water was empty now, just waves and wind, no trace that a B-29 and 2 men had disappeared there. The destroyer's captain approached, a weathered man in his 40s who'd seen enough war to understand what Jarrell was feeling. "Hell of a piece of flying, Captain. Hell of a piece of flying." Jarrell didn't respond immediately. He was thinking about Thompson, who'd left a wife and 2 daughters in Ohio. About Riley, who'd been 19 years old and planning to become a teacher after the war. About how they'd made it 3,000 miles on 2 engines, then 1 engine, then no engines at all, only to lose 2 men in the final moment. "We hit the target," Jarrell finally said. "That's something." "That's everything," the Navy captain replied. "The Nakajima plant is rubble. Intel reports say you knocked out at least 40% of their engine production capacity. That's 40% fewer fighters we'll face over Okinawa, over Japan. That's American lives saved." The mathematics of war. 2 men lost, but dozens, maybe hundreds, saved by the mission's success. The equation was supposed to balance out. It never did. 3 weeks later, the 499th Bombardment Group held a memorial service for Lieutenant James Thompson and Staff Sergeant Michael Riley. Their names were added to the list of men who died in service of the strategic bombing campaign, a list that grew longer every day. Captain Howard Jarrell flew 17 more missions before the war ended in August. He never lost another man. His crew called him lucky after that, though Jarrell himself never felt particularly lucky. Lucky would have been bringing everyone home. The B-29 that ditched near Iwo Jima, tail number 42 to 24,628, was never recovered. She rests somewhere on the Pacific floor, 2 miles down in darkness, surrounded by the wrecks of hundreds of other aircraft that didn't make it home. The ocean keeps its dead. The Nakajima plant at Musashino never recovered from the raid. Post-war assessments confirmed that the March 1945 bombing destroyed critical tooling and killed dozens of skilled workers whose expertise couldn't be replaced. Japanese fighter production dropped precipitously in the following months, contributing to the air superiority that made the invasion of Okinawa possible and ultimately led to Japan's surrender. Flight engineer Raymond Mallow survived the war and became an airline pilot, flying commercial routes across the same Pacific Ocean that had nearly killed him. He refused to fly over water without checking the engine instruments 3 times. Bombardier Thomas Hanna went back to teaching mathematics in Nebraska, where he never told his students why he flinched every time he heard unexpected thunder. Radio operator William Connors opened a hardware store in Pennsylvania and lived to be 93 years old. He never flew in an airplane again. The waist gunners, DeLuca and Steinberg, became lifelong friends, meeting once a year on the anniversary of the crash to drink beer and remember the men who didn't make it back. Tail gunner Frank Morrison had nightmares about drowning for 40 years, dreams where he was trapped in his gun position as the aircraft sank, water rising around him, unable to escape. He learned to live with them. The story of the B-29 that crossed the Pacific on one engine became legend in the bomber groups, told and retold around mess tables and briefing rooms, embellished and burnished until it took on mythic proportions. But the men who lived it knew the truth. It wasn't about heroism or courage or any of the words that get carved on monuments. It was about 10 men doing their jobs in circumstances that should have killed them, about making 1,000 small decisions correctly when any one mistake would have meant death, about an aircraft that kept flying long after it should have fallen from the sky. It was about reaching toward an impossible goal with everything you had, knowing the odds were against you, knowing you'd probably fail, but trying anyway because the alternative was giving up, and giving up meant defeat. And it was about the price of war, a price measured in young men who never came home, in families who received telegrams instead of their sons, in empty chairs at dinner tables and names carved in stone. Captain Jarrell visited Thompson's widow after the war. He told her that her husband died quickly, that he didn't suffer, that his sacrifice meant something. The first part was probably true. The second part was definitely a lie. Drowning is never quick. The third part. Jarrell wanted to believe it, needed to believe it, but in the dark hours of the night he was never entirely sure. On a map, the distance from Tokyo to Iwo Jima is 700 miles. The distance from Iwo Jima to Saipan is another 700 miles. Together, they represent the vast spaces of the Pacific War, the terrible geography that swallowed so many men and machines. But for the crew of B-29 number 42 to 24,628, those distances represent something more. The longest flight of their lives, measured not in miles but in heartbeats, in breaths held during the fighter attacks and released during the ditching, in the seconds between impact and escape, between sinking and rescue, between death and improbable survival. 8 men came home from that mission. 2 didn't. The ocean remembers them all.